Welcome to Health System CIO's interview with Hugo Lai, Chief Information Security Officer with Temple Health. I'm Anthony Guerra, founder and editor-in-chief. Hugo, thanks for joining me.
Good morning, Anthony.
Hugo, can we start out? Why don't you tell me a little bit about your organization and your role there?
Sure. So I work for Temple Health. It is a four hospital systems based in Philadelphia, in Pennsylvania, and I am the Chief Information Security Officer here.
Very good. Thank you. Can you tell me how you wound up as CISO at a health system, sort of your career and how you wound up getting into technology and then security and then healthcare and whatever order that happened?
Certainly. So I started off my security career as a security consultant for many years. Actually, if we step a little bit back, I studied information security when I was in college, and basically after I graduated, I got recruited to support a government client working in security consulting. And I continued with that for many years, and I supported many government clients, and including NIH and some of the civilian healthcare agencies, if you will. That's got myself into the healthcare industry, and then after that, I started working in the industry, leading a cybersecurity practice for small organizations, and then here I am, with Temple Health.
What would you say it is about security that you find most interesting? Why, there's sort of the CIO route and then there's the CISO route. So why did you prefer to go into security as opposed to general technology, CIO type stuff?
Well, security has always been my interest. I think it has a little bit to do with the experience, when I used to work and study, near the Capitol. There was the September 11th, obviously. And I still remember that day, walking on the street. I was actually working as doing some part-time work very near the Capitol. And the event happened. So the immediate thing, that came to my mind is that, if that can happen, in the physical world, right, it can also happen in the cybersecurity space. So, and that, struck me really hard, in my mind. I was like, okay, this is going to be the next, big thing that's going to be happening. So I, certainly focus in information security. And I believe that, this is a field, that needs a lot of help, for sure.
Very interesting. What would you say are a couple of the trends that you're looking at and trying to stay on top of, or positioning your organization to be ready for?
Identity access management is certainly one. And a lot of my colleagues, obviously think that this is going to be the next parameter, if you will.
Yeah.
And I strongly agree with that. There's identities in everything, right? Like in humans, in assets, in devices, everything has an identity associated with it. So if you can protect identity well, that certainly helps to reduce, the attack surface, for the organization. Nowadays, many attacks, you don't really need to, for example, like have a sophisticated attack, right? If you have a leaked credentials, right, that's the easiest way to get into an organization. So if you can protect it well, you are a step ahead.
So for identity and access management, it's not, from what I understand, it's where you want to move, but it's not that easy, especially when you get to the granular level. Can you tell me your thoughts about the challenges of really implementing that kind of a program?
Yes. So for identity access management, there are many touch points, and you really need to have the buy-in from the organization in order to do it well. Access is always the first thing that someone would request, right, when they join the organization. And if they don't get the appropriate access, then you got screamed at, basically. So you have to do it well. So I think from the beginning, you want to make sure that, the organization understands, this is going to be a process that they have to go through, right? And access, touches, too many departments, from HR, from IT to clinical, right? And you need to make sure that all the stakeholders are involved, understand their roles, and then you have to guide them, step by step into the process. You cannot do everything at once, so you need to have good planning in doing that.
Right. So, I mean, by very definition, you are managing access. And anytime you're managing access, you perhaps are unfortunately making it requiring an extra step, takes a few extra seconds. And anytime you do that, you're going to bother somebody who hasn't remembered their password, who is just annoyed in general with having to take a few extra seconds. So you have to manage that. You have to deal with the angry phone calls, I guess, on occasion come to you. You're balancing usability with security, which is what a main part of your job is, right? Managing usability with security. But this is an area where I suppose you have to do something. You have to not create a big barrier to usability, but there has to be a slight speed bump. Is that the best way to think about it?
That is correct. Yes, there will be pain points along the way, but if you can help all the stakeholders to understand what they are, I think in the long run, right, everyone will benefit from that.
Right. Very good. All right. Let's talk a little about compliance. I think you've done quite a bit of work in the compliance area. How would you describe the state of compliance today in terms of what CISOs need to do?
I think compliance is it's a must, if you will, in the cybersecurity space. You always want to have checks and balances. So as a CISO, I try to work very closely with the compliance officer, trying to understand what their concerns are and help to to address it, the issues proactively, if you will. I often see compliance as a partner, right? And we all try to achieve the same thing. And I think through the audit process, it also helps the organization to understand the processes, particularly in information security a little bit more as well, right? Understanding the weaknesses. Sometimes when you are too into your day-to-day operations, there are things that you don't see, right? And compliance comes in to help you understand what perhaps you may be missing in that process.
And I know the titles, there are a lot of titles around there that include privacy, obviously security, there's legal folks. So in terms of who you have to work with to do your job effectively, it sounds like almost everybody in the C-suite and maybe more, but tell me your thoughts on the key individuals that you need to have very good relationships with to be successful.
I think as a C-level executive, you want to have a good working relationship with everyone within the organization. But the ones that I interact with the most, certainly includes compliance, right? The compliance officer, your general counsel's office, for example, and then HR. Yeah, for sure.
And the CIO, obviously.
Of course, yeah.
Right.
The CIO, the CTOs, yes, absolutely.
You report to the CIO?
I do.
Yeah, and that seems to be the most common setup out there. I think there's a few variations on that in terms of where CISOs are reporting. Do you have any thoughts on what you think works, or can anything work depending on the individuals involved?
I think each of the model will work. It really depends on the maturity level of the organizations. So sometimes, information security needs to work, together with IT, right? And you cannot really exceed, the pace of the IT. So for example, like if you have a lot of infrastructures that needs to be upgraded, the CISO needs to work together with the CIO, to partner with him or with her, to get that done together, right? You cannot really on the first day you jump in and it's like, okay, let's refresh everything, because that's not possible, right? So I think it depends on, the organization's, maturity level from an IT perspective. In some ways, yes, it works to have, the CISO report to the CIO. But I've also seen, other organizations where you have the CIOs, report directly to the COO, or some other C-level executives as well.
Very good, very good. Let's talk about audits. We talked about compliance. I believe you've been through audits and things like that. Do you have any advice to your colleagues? I mean, that can be one of the most unpleasant letters that you get, the notification that you're going to be audited. It usually doesn't present a very good feeling, that you know what's coming, because audits can last months, years. They can go on forever. They can be very intrusive. But what's your advice for a CISO who just finds out they're about to be audited?
I think preparation is key. You cannot really jump into an audit, without preparation, if you will. So on a day-to-day basis, you really need to make sure that you have all the documentations available, and have a robust process, right? When the audit comes in, I think it's just a matter of validating whether you are actually doing what you're supposed to be doing, right? So there shouldn't be anything surprising per se in an audit. Obviously understanding the regulations that will help, but I think there are times that you want to really have a conversation with the auditor to truly understand what they are trying to achieve in that audit, right? Or what that objective is. And you might want to perhaps have an angle, because cybersecurity is not something that is easily understandable for individuals outside of cybersecurity, right? So you really need to help them understand why is it important that you're doing what you are doing, right?
Right.
And at the same time help them to understand that, hey, how you are achieving or meeting their objectives in doing what you do.
Right. Cyber insurance is a huge issue, right? And I think when you apply for cyber insurance these days, it sounds like essentially you're being audited, although it may be all self-reporting, right? You are giving them all the information. I don't think they're coming in and checking everything. Although, if you attest to anything that you are not doing and there's an issue, they're not going to pay. I've read an article about that recently where they said the insurance company said, "Hey, I think it was multi-factor authentication." They said, "You said you had multi-factor authentication. We gave you the policy. There was a breach. Turns out you weren't using it. We're not paying." So, at a high level, cyber insurance. I don't know if you've been through that recently, but how would you describe that process today? And maybe anything you found that works in terms of either attaining it or dealing with that process.
From a cyber insurance standpoint, I think the best way is don't think of it as a insurance policy. I think that's more like the last resort, right?
Uh-huh.
So I don't think about it too much, to be honest with you. Yes, it is essentially as when it comes to applying for the insurance, there's a slew of questions that you have to answer, but that should be the security controls that a CISO or the information security program should be addressing from the first place, right? So again, there shouldn't be anything surprising in there in the first place. I think as long as you have good strategic planning in your information security program, right? The cyber insurance company sometimes they're also willing to help you out as well.
So it's very interesting. So it sounds like a lot of what you're saying is if you're doing your job the right way, then you don't really have to sit around and stress about what if I get audited? How am I going to get cyber insurance? If you're doing your job the right way, you really don't have that much to worry about. Is that kind of your approach to the job?
Yeah, yeah. And obviously, you cannot do everything at once. So what's important to, behind this is that you need to have a clear rationale, right? As of why you are doing what you're doing now and
Uh-huh.
why you are doing, other security controls, perhaps, like half a year down the road or a year down the road, right? Um, you are helping the organization um, to manage information security risks, right? It is impossible to eliminate or to remediate all risks, but as long as you help the organization to understand what these risks are and have a game plan for it, then I think everyone is on the same page, right? And it doesn't matter, whether you get audited or not, right? Like you have your entire colleagues, in the C-suites, to be supporting you on that.
That's a really great point. You can't do everything at once. A lot of things need to be done. So it makes me think of, you know, IT governance in general is a huge, very important issue or process in health systems, right? There's a certain amount of money, there's a certain amount of time, and a million things are requested. So how do we decide what to do? That's IT governance. You're talking about the same thing for IT security. There has to be a governance process that says, out of we're going to stratify our risks. Here are the things we need to do. Here's the risk level we're assigning to each. What are we going to do first? Now, can you talk about, do you have a defined process for deciding that with committees and all that, that help decide the order? And then, as you said, down the road, if you have an auditor come in or there's an issue, you can rationally explain, here's our roadmap. It's stratified by risk and importance. Here's why we haven't done the seventh thing on the list. It's coming. So you can at least explain that to any interested party. But can you give me your thoughts or process around IT security governance for making those decisions?
Yeah, I think this is where, it's important to have good communication with your peers, right? Within the organizations. Um, you need to help them understand, what your priorities are. And at the same time, you need to also understand what their priorities are, right? And you need to find that right balance. So I think information security governance, there you can have a formal process around it, but at the same time, um, just just a day-to-day communication, right? Your
Mm-hmm.
interactions, with your peers. Um, Sometimes that defines the process already, right? Like you are trying to get an understanding of, what's important in mind and try to align the initiatives together, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and essentially, that's what you need to do, I think, and there, in addition to that, I guess, there will also be times that you need to be a little bit flexible as well, right? So as much as you have a very defined, information security roadmap, you also want to identify areas that, potentially is a quick win, right? And when an opportunity arises, those will be the occasions that, hey, perhaps it makes sense, to execute or do those initiatives, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because if you don't do it now, then there will be no better timing to do it.
Right.
A good example would be, for example, like if an organization, experience a breach, right? All of a sudden, you have all the attention, to really, formulate, the information security program, to what you want to do, right? So you don't want to put that to waste, right? Obviously, I'm not saying that, you should wait for
Right.
for an incident to happen, but there will be, other opportunities, if the organization is, perhaps, for example, like taking on a cloud initiatives, right? So you want to do your homework up front, right? Knowing, what's coming and be prepared, to tackle those initiatives, together with the rest of your colleagues, right? And do those together. So have a information security roadmap defined, but at the same time, try to think ahead, and I think those will be key, or at least, from my perspective, how to build a good information security program.
Right. Plan, but be flexible. Do you have a particular framework that you work towards? A lot of people like NIST. There's certain benefits for doing some of these. There's 405D, which has some information out there. If you can show that you've worked towards these particular frameworks, you sort of have not a safe harbor, but you get the benefit of the doubt from the government. I mean, these are formal things. I mean, do you have any particular roadmap or framework that you work towards?
Yeah, I think the NIST cybersecurity framework, it's definitely the de facto standard, if you will, for many organizations. So it has been vetted, by the government. Is very comprehensive. It's easily adoptable, to many industries and organizations. So in my mind, that's the framework that I would use for sure.
Okay. When we talk about communicating risk, do you have any thoughts around, because you don't want to be making um, the decision per se. You want to, from what I understand, you want to communicate to the business leaders, maybe the CEO or the COO or even the CIO. You want to communicate the levels of risk in any situation, and they'll decide, right? They make the decision about how much risk they want to accept in any particular area. Is that correct in terms of how that process should work? And what's your advice for making sure that you are communicating as you wish? Because you're sometimes translating IT security speak to business speak, right? Because you have to make sure the individual you're speaking to understands what you're saying. So what are your thoughts around that?
Yeah, so I think as a CISO, you certainly have to take up that responsibility, right, to make sure that you're communicating the cyber risks to the business leaders. Maybe a better way to approach this is that you really have to come in with an angle, right, and provide them with some options to pick. They hire CISO for a reason, right? So you have to be prepared, when being asked, for recommendations. You need to know what you're doing, right? You need to understand, what the business is lacking. So in not really, dumping the problem, to them as of like how you want to manage it, but rather, you want to give like several options, right? So that they can pick the right one, in order to manage the risk appropriately.
That's a great point, right? Give them options. Let's talk a little bit about sort of today's workforce. In a number of your sort of recommendations that I read on your LinkedIn profile, they talked about that you seek the input of your colleagues and you work to ensure that that input is utilized. So you make people feel valued. You're gathering opinions, make them feel valued and included. It mentioned your kindness and willingness to support your team. So certainly you sound like somebody pleasant to work for. I would imagine that's part of what you believe in order to create a well-functioning team. There's a lot of workforce issues out there. People have a lot of choice, especially in cyber. They don't even need to stay in healthcare, right? They could go in any industry. I mean, those skills are very transferable. So you have to bring more than a paycheck to the table, especially at a health system where you can't perhaps pay Silicon Valley salaries. So what's your approach to creating an environment that specifically cybersecurity folks want to work in and can feel fulfilled working in?
Right. So certainly nowadays there are many challenges, in recruiting the right talent into cybersecurity. My approach to this is to obviously empower your team to do what is important, right? But I also think that is equally important to help your team understand the challenges that the CISO is facing on a regular basis, right? So that they can align with your thoughts. I also think that it's important to let your team be aware of the all the different issues out there and be transparent with them, right? So the more that you can do that, I think the easier it will be, for the team, to form that camaraderie, if you will, right,
Mm-hmm.
together, that we're all achieving, the same goals and objectives. Healthcare is very challenging. I think in my mind, if you really want to form a good team, you need to make sure that your team understands the objective of the organization, that they believe in that mission, right? There are many options out there for a good cybersecurity engineer or analyst, if you will. But if you make them believe in the mission of the organization and they believe in your strategy in building the information security program, right? And I think that helps not only just to retain them, but I think on a day-to-day basis, you're building a more effective team out of.
So a couple things there. Number one, it sounded like what you're saying is don't sugarcoat it in terms of your team. Tell them not only what you're facing as a group, but you personally as a CISO. So guys, here's what I have to manage and deal with. Here's what we all have to deal with. So now we're all on the same page. Don't sugarcoat it and kind of make them think things are easier than they are. Is that what you're saying?
Correct.
Right.
And I think the more that you can share with the team, you're also helping them to groom them, right? You're
Mm-hmm.
grooming them to become the next CISO or the next, leaders, right? In the industry. So I think, the team will appreciate that.
Yeah. When you say tied to the mission, in healthcare, everybody needs to be tied to the patient care aspect of what they do. Obviously, as you get into IT security, you get a bit more removed, but I think what you're saying is you want them to feel tied to actual patient care. And how do you go about doing that? Some people used to say, well, I have my IT team round. We actually round so we could see how people use the technologies that we protect. But do you have thoughts? Do you want them to remember that what they do affects patient care?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yep. So obviously, for the ones that we hire, they understand that, they believe in it, but you kind of also have to help them, remind them, right? Like as of, why we're doing what we're
Hmm.
doing, right?
Hmm.
And sometimes, just having that, just show them around, like, I one thing that I truly believe in information security is that, you need to tie it, to the business, right? So, and apply context into information security, right? There's no one, interpretation of a security control, if you will, in the audit, in the audit language, there's always like many different angles to it. So how you approach it, it's important. And you have to show your team how you're approaching information security, right? Or how you're applying the information security principles, within the organizations. So show them around, like the different, technologies that the health systems is using, and make sure that they understand, why, we are doing it the way that we choose to do it, right?
Right.
I think that's important, and also allow them to see, some of the challenges that the clinicians are facing out there, right?
Right.
And I think that way, you are building a relationship, and also helping, the team to understand, how they should tackle, some of the problems in information security on a day-to-day basis,
Right.
or how they
Uh,
should be.
we are almost out of time. Just as a final question, I want to ask you about CISO burnout. Um, Burnout's tough. Burnout's all over healthcare, and I would imagine in security, it's right there, and especially at the CISO position. So, what are your thoughts on managing work-life balance, avoiding burnout, and what is your, if you don't mind me asking, what is your number one thing to do when you want to relax? What's your go-to Whether it could be simple as watching TV, but do you have a hobby or a go-to that helps you step away?
Right. I don't have a hobby per se. I think, I
Information
often go
security.
back to my family,
Yeah.
but I do practice martial arts, and I think
Oh.
that helps. Yeah. And I practice martial arts together with my daughter. That's kind of, my thing to do, right?
Uh-huh.
When I get off work. And through that, I think that really helps to, to manage the stress level. But again, I think to wrap this around, right? Like, if I have to worry about, the next attack, like all the time, it's not going to make me, very effective in my role. So I always think about this, right? Like, there are so many choices,
Hmm.
that we have to do, or so many decisions that we have to make. As long as we are making a conscious decision, right, whatever that may be, right, we know we can always back that up, right? And when a breach happened, really need to, rely on your team or your colleagues, right? So as long as you have that relationship, with your peers, then I think at the end of the day, well, that's just something, that you have to get it done together, right? But at least you can rely on someone, from a psychologically,
Yeah.
like psychological perspective, you know that you're not alone, right? As much as you are the CISO within the organization, but you know that, there are peers out there that and your team is, right behind you, right, in tackling the same problem. So,
Awesome, Hugo. Wonderful, wonderful talk. I think our readers are really going to enjoy it. So I want to thank you very much for your time today.
thank you very much, Anthony.